What's up, everybody? We're back with another fantasy football video. Today's video, we are doing Week 12 buy low, sell high, waiver wires and drops. We're into the home stretch of the fantasy football season. It's make or break time if you're going to make the playoffs. In this video, I'm going to help you get those last few wins, set yourself up for success in the playoffs, and win your fantasy football championship. If you're interested in more content like this, please check out my channel for fantasy football. And I also make a wide variety of other content as well, to include song covers, song reactions, etc. So check out my channel if you're interested. So, generally, this is the last week for making trades. In a lot of sleeper leagues, this is your last week. ESPN, generally, the week of Thanksgiving is the last week that you can make trades in those leagues. So this is going to be my last video where I talk specifically about buy low and sell high. But I do want to talk specific strategies in this video for how you can get those last few trades to really give yourself the boost to move from a good team to a great team that can win a fantasy football championship. So I'm going to go over that in a bit. So little bit of a preview. My next few weeks I'll talk a little bit different topics that go into more of the waiver wire strategy, the matchup strategy to set yourself up for success 1 week at a time, getting into that playoff stretch. And yeah, so before I get into individual strategies regarding trades, I want to talk about some of the bye weeks coming up. The buys for this week are Kansas City and Arizona. So some players to consider as a buy low, as in coming off a bye or going into their bye and good opportunity to trade for them. I would try to make an offer for DeAndre Hopkins. He's been out for a few weeks, not had a great season relative to where he's been drafted. So some managers may be impatient with him and be willing to cut him. But with Arizona, Hopkins is their best receiver when he's healthy. They're definitely trying to let him rest, make sure he's good for the home stretch when they're trying to seal that playoff berth. And on top of that, Arizona's got the number 7 strength of schedule for weeks 15 to 17 when the most leagues have their fantasy football playoffs. So I'll get into that specifically, but these are all great reasons why you should try to go after DeAndre Hopkins. Buy. So this is somebody that you want to try to sell away going into their bye week. I would try to sell Zach Ertz. Great game in week 11. He had 8 receptions, 88 yards, and 2 touchdowns. But that is not sustainable. I do not think that is going to be the norm for him, especially when Kyler Murray is back and he's able to expand the field to more of his weapons. Colt McCoy, mostly just relying on the tight end because that's all he's really capable of. And Zach Ertz is the number 6 tight end on the season solely because he hasn't had his bye like a lot of the players behind him. So this is a good opportunity to try to sell Zach Ertz after his bye week. Get a tight end that's going to give you more consistency, like a Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, Mark Andrews. It's going to be difficult, but if you compare Ertz and a flex, like a running back and a wide receiver, it's a good deal. Buy. These are people that I would recommend that you cut into their bye week, and you want to part with Mecole Hardman and Byron Pringle. They are just simply not consistent enough or reliable enough to hold through their bye. Hardman in particular has scored 5 PPR points or less the last 3 weeks. Pringle is also another guy who's very touchdown dependent for his production. Did not have a great game against Dallas. Not worth holding either of these guys. Winners versus losers, player of the week. So these are guys that I recommend, but depending on your record this season, you want to trade for or trade away. And it's going to be 2 players this week that are very similarly related to each other. Jaylen Waddle and Devonta Smith. 2 Alabama receivers, both high draft picks this season. And they've shown signs of promise this season, especially over the second half of the season. They've really kind of stepped up their production. But they are both plagued by inconsistency, and you never know exactly what you're going to get. Smith had 2 great weeks from week 9 and 10, but for week 11 kind of dipped off a little bit. Waddle, kind of the same thing, but he did have a better week 11. But what I would recommend, if you have a losing record, then you need to win the next 3 weeks to get yourself in the playoffs. I'm talking week 12, 13, and 14. You want to make sure that you can win those weeks. And Jaylen Waddle and Devonta Smith have buys in week 14. So you're not going to be able to use them in that week to set yourself up for the playoffs. So they're really not going to do much good for you just sitting on your bench. You want to try to flip them for some guys that you can ensure will give you the consistency and give you the chance to make the playoffs. You can't count on these guys' inconsistency at this point in the season. Whereas if you have a winning record and you're set to make the playoffs, these two players have the number 1 and number 2 schedules for wide receivers in weeks 15 to 17. I'm going to go through all of those position by position breakdown in a little bit, but keep that in mind. If you have a winning record, I would definitely try to trade for Waddle and Smith, with the caveat that there is going to be some inconsistency expected. But if you have a winning record and you want to take the chance to go for those high ceiling potential guys, these are two flyers to take advantage of. So now we will go into trade strategy. Before I get into the buy low, sell high, waivers and drops, I just want to talk the difference of trades that you're making at this point in the season versus earlier in the season. So early in the season, you're trying to take advantage of bad weeks and you're trying to see if you can flip somebody based on a few bad weeks. But now that we've gotten 11 weeks into the season, you kind of have a good picture of a lot of these guys. So one week or another is not going to fool a lot of managers, or at least good managers will not panic. That being said, by all means, if you do see one of these guys that does have a very bad week 11 and you want to try to take advantage of it, it doesn't hurt to ask, but it's going to take a little bit more to try to get those guys. That also, if you own one of those players who had a bad week this past week, I would not recommend trying to trade them. So what do you look for then? So there's 3 things that I generally look for when it comes to trading for players at this later point towards the deadline. The first is that you want to find guys that are the focal point, guys that have volume, lot of touches, a lot of backfield snaps, a lot of targets, stuff like that, especially compared to their competition. You're not looking as much at the touchdowns, but you want to see guys that are getting heavily involved. Because these, there's going to be bad matchups from time to time, games that are very dependent on the weather, dependent on various factors. But especially if you can get a running back that gets a lot of volume, that will really be beneficial as we get into these cold weather games where teams are going to be running the ball more. Number 2 thing that I look for is consistency. I try to target guys that are going to be more consistent that I can rely upon. You can go for the ceiling guys if you feel confident, but understand that if you get burnt by let's say, like a good example is Mike Williams. Let's say that Mike Williams, you 1 week you get that 30-point game like he gave you at the beginning of the season, but then he gives you a 2-point game like he has much of that middle stretch of the season. It's going to really hurt you. So go for guys that are giving you consistent performance week by week. Those are the ones that I want to target as guys that I can rely upon getting into the playoffs. And then the last thing I look for is that strength of schedule, setting up for the fantasy football playoffs. If you have some guys that are on the fringe of starting, maybe they're in your RB3 flex, wide receiver 3 flex consideration. These are guys that you want to, they're not huge enough pieces that you need to hold on to through the playoffs depending on the matchups. So if you have some of those type of players and they have tough matchups, I would recommend trying to flip them for players who have better matchups. So I'm going to go through now the strength of schedule for all positions in fantasy football. I'm talking the offensive positions, not like individual defensive players and stuff like that. But for weeks 15 to 17, when most leagues are going to be having their fantasy football championship run. So let's start with the quarterback position. The top 5 easiest strength of schedule for quarterbacks are Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Green Bay, and the New York Jets. The 5 hardest are Carolina, Kansas City, Atlanta, Baltimore, and New England. So let's take a look at what you're looking for in this, just some things that come to mind here. So for quarterbacks, so I'm going to get into Jimmy G in a little bit, but Jimmy G having the 3rd easiest schedule definitely makes him a more attractive option as a streaming candidate. I'll get into him in more detail later. It's also an interesting flyer in deep leagues to take a look at Zach Wilson again. If you know you're relying on a light schedule that they have, maybe he could break out. So those are some considerations. I wouldn't like picking him up at this time, but it's something to consider. And then for quarterbacks with tough schedules, you're not doing anything with Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson because they are some of the elite quarterbacks that you try to hold on to. I'm not by any means saying because they have a difficult schedule you trade them. But guys that I would be more concerned about are the number one difficult strength of schedule, Cam Newton, who struggled last season late in the year. And then teams like New England, where Mac Jones, very limited ceiling, probably going to be even lower with tougher matchups to close the season. Running backs. So the best running back schedules in weeks 15 to 17. Jacksonville, number one, Denver, Detroit, Chicago, and the Los Angeles Rams. The 5 most difficult schedules are, once again, Carolina, New England, Las Vegas, New Orleans, and Minnesota. So good schedules. Going to talk about James Robinson later, so not going to go into too much depth now, but that is a great trade target. Other ones to look at, depending on how you feel about the Denver running backs, though they are going to be splitting with each other. David Montgomery as well. I'm going to talk about him more later. But you got the bad schedules. So Christian McCaffrey, do not try to trade him away. Additionally, Minnesota, I don't think that Dalvin Cook is somebody that you want to trade away. But guys that you would be looking to potentially flip are Josh Jacobs, who's been disappointing this season, and Damian Harris, Ramondre Stevenson for the New England Patriots with a difficult schedule for running backs. Wide receivers. So the top wide receiver schedules, Philadelphia and Miami, already talked about them. San Francisco, Pittsburgh, and the Jets. So interesting. You got guys like Elijah Moore breaking out now. This is going to really give you even more fuel to that fire if you have him. Great player to be owning right now. Bad schedules. So you're looking at Denver as the worst schedule, Washington, Cleveland, Atlanta, and Buffalo. So in these kind of situations, so Terry McLaurin, I would not be looking to trade him. He's got a tough schedule, but he does get a lot of volume. But granted, if you can get a receiver that will give you some more volume and a better schedule, like Deontay Johnson on the Pittsburgh side with the top 5 schedule, I would definitely do that. But I would not just sell McLaurin for the sake of selling him. But other ones that come to mind to me are Emmanuel Sanders for Buffalo with a top 5 difficult schedule. That's somebody you definitely want to try to flip, as well as somebody like Jerry Jeudy in Denver. Tight ends. So the top 5 easiest schedules for tight ends: Washington, the New York Jets, Denver, Cleveland, and New Orleans. So ones that stand out there for me are Logan Thomas. I'm going to talk about him in a little bit, so not going to go too much in depth there, but don't forget about him. And then the most 5 difficult schedules. So you got Atlanta, Miami, Detroit, Buffalo, and Dallas. And this is interesting because for tight ends, there are a lot of fringe guys in that group of 5 difficult schedules that are great trade away candidates. I'm going to talk about them in a little bit. But guys like Mike Gesicki, TJ Hawkinson, Dawson Knox, it kind of depends on your opinion of him. And then, other ones though, like Kyle Pitts for Atlanta. I would not recommend selling him because he is the focal point of that offense. Defenses. So defenses, granted, this is based on stats earlier in the season. You do have to pay attention for defenses on the way their offense looks now. So, for instance, Seattle really struggling on offense right now. That plays into considerations with some of these defensive streams if that were to continue by the time it gets to the playoffs. But the best strength of schedules: San Francisco, Buffalo, Tampa Bay, Jacksonville, and Seattle. So San Francisco is definitely a great waiver wire pickup if they're still out there. And then Buffalo I'm going to talk about in a little bit for strategy with your last minute trades. Bad schedules: Washington, they're a defense that really shouldn't be owned anyway. Chicago, Carolina, Atlanta, and Cleveland. So this is potentially, if you still own Carolina based on early season success, a consideration in trading them away, as I recommended last week. Kickers. And kickers, I do not base kickers based on strength of schedule of their opponent. I base it on how their own offense is playing. If their offense is going to be getting touchdowns, setting themselves up in position to score, but not punching it in, those are great games for kickers. If you have an incompetent offense that does not manage to do anything, it really hurts kickers' values. So you do kind of have to look at the matchup that they're playing in the game more so than just the stats versus kickers. But the top 5 kicker schedules: Seattle, the Jets, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Miami. And then the 5 most difficult schedules: Las Vegas Rams, Buffalo Bills, Baltimore Ravens, Pittsburgh Steelers, and Indianapolis Colts. So that concludes my trade strategy differences. So now I'm going to talk buy low and sell high along with waivers and drops to close this video. So buy low quarterbacks. I talked about him last week, but Kyler Murray is definitely a guy you should try to buy low on. It's going to be a difficult sell, but having spent the last 3 weeks off, going into a bye next week, some managers may not be patient enough to hold him. But he has a great schedule in the fantasy football playoffs. His is the number 6 schedule, so in weeks 15 to 17. So this is definitely a guy you want to take advantage of in a trade. And I put Dak Prescott and Patrick Mahomes in that category as well. Both of them did not have good games in the past game. They both played each other, but they're excellent quarterbacks. You want to try to buy low on games like this. Another interesting buy low candidate for quarterbacks is Tua. So Tua, he's been a lot better this season, but he's flying under the radar because of a lot of the negative press that he got last season and the fact that his team is just not very good. But Tua has been playing a little better as of late. He did pretty well against Miami, in which he had 17 fantasy points. And he has a very light schedule for quarterbacks to close the season. So weeks 15, 16, and 17, that fantasy football playoffs, he's got the Jets, which we all know how their defense can be at times. Got New Orleans, which they have been a good defense before, but have not looked good the past 2 weeks. And then Tennessee, which is a very up and down defense as well. So all very exploitable matchups for Tua. He is a great fringe candidate quarterback, especially in 2 quarterback leagues that you can target. And another guy I want to bring up as well is Jimmy Garoppolo. I mentioned earlier that he has the 3rd easiest fantasy football playoff schedule for quarterbacks. I think he is a good 2 quarterback league buy low candidate because he does not make mistakes. He doesn't hurt you with bad decisions, bad play, anything to that effect that really negatively will hurt your quarterback play. He doesn't have as much upside in terms of his yardage, but he's got some matchups to close the season where they are going to be throwing quite often. And Jimmy Garoppolo, with a light schedule, and he's been a pretty consistent stream option anyway, I think he's a great buy low target for some of these fringe quarterbacks that may have just had 1 or 2 good games and are likely not going to be sustainable. One of them, which I'll talk in a bit. Buy low running backs. My number 1 buy low running back is James Robinson. James Robinson has the easiest strength of schedule for running backs to close the season. He has some very nice matchups. I will get to them in a bit. But the other thing that I really like about James Robinson is that he is the Jacksonville offense. The receivers are not reliable. Trevor Lawrence is not reliable. Dan Arnold, we thought could be reliable, but he just kind of fell off the cliff of late. But what I really like about James Robinson is that he gets a heavy volume. He's a great pass-catching running back, and the team wants to move the ball through him. You look furthermore at their matchups. In week 15 and 16, he's got the Houston Texans and the New York Jets, which are 2 of the worst run defenses in football. So you're opening your fantasy football playoff schedule, and James Robinson should feast. He's got a little bit more difficult of a schedule in week 17 where he's got New England, but because Houston and New York are so bad, it makes them the number 1, Jacksonville the number 1 schedule for running backs based on their strength of schedule that they have. So James Robinson, definitely want to try to target him. He's been dealing with an injury and kind of had a slow game in week 11, but I definitely want to be targeting him. Another guy I want to target as well is David Montgomery. Very similar situation of Robinson. Montgomery was out for a little longer, but he is getting a lot of volume for Chicago, and they have the 4th easiest strength of schedule remaining for running backs. So David Montgomery has looked good this season. He's just been inhibited by poor quarterback play, but I do suspect that as the season progresses, they're going to rely more on David Robinson. He showed this last year when he broke out to close the season. I really would recommend you try to target him. Or excuse me, I called him David Robinson. His name is David Montgomery. My apologies there. But anyway, target him. He is a great buy low candidate to close this season. Another guy that I really like too, and this is recorded before the Tampa Bay New York Giants game. So pending hopefully no injuries by Leonard Fournette. Leonard Fournette has also had some tough matchups. He did have a good week 10, but he had 2 tough matchups before, and then he had his bye. So he kind of had people's opinion on him went down. But he is another heavily involved running back who's also a very good PPR back. A lot of people don't necessarily think about that when they think of Fournette. But I would recommend trying to buy low on him because of the volume that he gets in that offense. Another guy I would recommend as well for different reasons is Tony Pollard. So Zeke Elliott has been dealing with a banged up knee the last few weeks and has had to exit the game from time to time. Tony Pollard has been getting involved even when Zeke is there. But if for some reason this injury continues to flare up, Tony Pollard is one of the best handcuffs in the league. I would definitely try to flip some of your fringe players who may have had a good game or two for a Tony Pollard. I would definitely try to do this just because of the upside that Tony Pollard could provide. If you have fringe receivers like a Marquise Valdez-Scantling, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and you can flip him for Pollard, I would definitely try to do that. Wide receivers to buy low. Number 1 I want to talk about is Keenan Allen. You're not necessarily buying low on him, but I do want to mention that he is one of the most underrated receivers. He has not blown up yet, but he has also been incredibly consistent. He has had no games under 10 full PPR points. He only has 2 touchdowns this season. So you figure that will change over time. And Los Angeles has some great matchups this season, not necessarily for wide receiver stats, but just matchups where they're expected to throw quite often, and they will rely on Keenan Allen. So this is a great buy low candidate because he's a guy that has not had a elite game this season, so he doesn't really come up on the forefront of people's minds of, oh, this guy is a stud, but he's so consistent and reliable, and he does have the talent to give you one of those games. It just hasn't happened yet. So this is a number 1 buy low wide receiver in my opinion. Number 2 is Deebo Samuel. He's already given you that upside. A lot of people are panicking because he only had 1 catch in his past game, and Brandon Ayuk was more involved. But you look throughout the season, and Samuel has been the better, more consistent receiver on this team. I personally think that the only reason he only had 1 catch against Jacksonville is because they were playing Jacksonville. You do not need to throw on them in order to be successful. So they were probably trying to get Ayuk involved, get him some of his touches. So I personally would recommend trying to buy low on Deebo Samuel. He is the best receiver on this team. He gives you that elite upside. This is a great time to buy low off a very modest game. And then another guy I would recommend buying low on, more in that fringe flex range, is Chase Claypool. Pittsburgh has a top 5 strength of schedule in the playoffs, and Claypool showed some signs of more involvement in Week 11. It was not a great game for him by any means, but he had, I believe, 9 targets in this game for 5 receptions and 93 yards. But the number 2 targeted receiver on this team, and Pittsburgh is going to have some matchups where they will need to throw it and get their receivers involved. So Claypool is a great guy to take a buy on, who's struggled in the middle stretch of the season but has good opportunity as the season goes along. And same applies to Deontay Johnson as well. He's got a great schedule. Not a receiver a lot of people think of as elite guy, but he's a solid wide receiver too for you to have. Another one that I would recommend buying low on just because of the situation of Week 11 is Rashod Bateman and Marquise Brown, both Ravens receivers. Fantasy managers that are impatient will panic in that situation and try to sell them because they had poor games and Marquise Brown didn't play. But look past the situation that Tyler Huntley was the quarterback and Lamar Jackson was out. These are great receivers to buy low on just because of their involvement over the past couple weeks with Lamar. Buy low tight ends. I talked about him last week, but I still like him in spite of a poor game against New England, and that's Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts is the top receiving option on this team. He will get some involvement later on. Atlanta has some better matchups to close the season, and they should need to rely on him as the game goes along. And the thing, too, with tight end strength of schedule that is deceiving is that a lot of times the tight end strength of schedule is good for certain teams because they haven't played the Kelseys, the Wallers, the Andrews, etc. So I would personally, in the case of Kyle Pitts, would recommend trying to buy low on him, even though he's got a difficult strength of schedule according to the numbers, because he is the best receiving option on this team. Other guys to consider as well, this is more of a temporary fill-in, as Dalton Schultz. So Amari Cooper, likely out for Thanksgiving. CeeDee Lamb, also likely out for Thanksgiving. So I'm going to talk about other Dallas receivers to pick up shortly, but Schultz is a good option too. He's an involved tight end. He's had good games in the past. This could be a great opportunity for him if you're looking for a short temporary buy to help you get into the playoffs. Buy low on the Buffalo Bills defense as well. So Buffalo struggled 2 of the last 3 weeks, especially against the Colts, -4 points, which is very disappointing for a defense that is ranked as high as them. But do not panic if you own the Buffalo Bills. But if you do happen to not own them, trade for them, because the last 4 games they have this season are Carolina, New England, Atlanta, and the New York Jets, which are all nothing special on the offensive end. So this is a great opportunity for the Buffalo defense. They will be an excellent trade for target, especially if you have a flex guy who had a great game this past week. I'll bring up some of those in a bit. Trade for the Buffalo defense. And then just to the side, never trade for kickers. Sell high. So I would recommend selling high on Justin Herbert. I know he's had a great game, but Justin Herbert has been a very inconsistent quarterback this season. Additionally, Pittsburgh was without their top 3 defensive players, TJ Watt, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Joe Hayden. So the numbers are a little bit deceiving there from that perspective. Additionally, you want to try to... Herbert has had a game this past week that is so good that you can flip him for some of these guys like Dak Prescott or Patrick Mahomes, maybe even Kyler Murray that I talked about earlier as part of a trade package. I would definitely try to do that. Not trying to brag, but in one of my leagues, I flipped Herbert. Earlier in the season, during Mahomes stretch, I flipped Herbert and Jerry Jeudy for Patrick Mahomes right before the Vegas game, and I was very happy about that. So this, what I'm basically using that example for, is that is a good example trade package. Herbert plus flex equals Mahomes as the trade. That's a great consideration that I would make. Other guys to try to sell high on. Carson Wentz, a top 10 quarterback right now, but please keep in mind that he has not had his bye week like a lot of these quarterbacks below him. Carson Wentz also has the 6th most difficult schedule for quarterbacks. So he didn't quite pop up in that top 5, but Carson Wentz is got a difficult schedule passing the ball. And as we've seen, especially in this Week 11 game with Jonathan Taylor going off, you can rely on Taylor, and you don't need Carson Wentz to really put up great stats. So try to sell Carson Wentz on the hanging his hat on, oh, he's a top 10 quarterback, he's a former MVP, things like that, and see if you can get some more value for him. If you could get a Jimmy Garoppolo out of it, I would recommend trying to do that. Big Ben is another guy I would try to sell high on. Big Ben had a great game against the Chargers, in which he had 3 touchdowns, 273 yards. But again, it's a situation where they were behind. They were playing in a dome. Probably why he had great numbers. Pittsburgh is going to have some rough weather games later on this season. Najee Harris is going to be heavily involved. I do, all that being said, I do like the passing game of what you're getting from guys like Chase Claypool and Deontay Johnson because of the target volume that's expected. But you should try to flip Big Ben off the name for a guy that will be a better playoff play for you, in my opinion, that's more consistent. Sell high running back. So I've talked about this guy all season as a sell high candidate, Myles Gaskin. And once again, he puts up another game where he gets a touchdown against a bad defense. He had heavy run volume of 24 carries, but had a very low yardage stat. I'm going to look it up real quick. 89 yards. So nothing special at all, especially considering one of those rushes was for 20 yards. So you take that out, that's 22 carries for 69 yards. Aside, you take out that 120-yard rush, that's pretty poor numbers right there. This is a guy you should definitely try to sell. He's been the definition of inconsistency all season. Another guy I would try to sell, I've talked about him quite a bit as well, James Conner. Leads the league in touchdowns. But James Conner, one, he does have a difficult schedule, not a top 5 schedule, but it's on the end of difficult for running backs in the fantasy football playoffs. And additionally, he's going to be getting Chase Edmonds back. And Chase Edmonds has not been anything special so far this season. But what I will say is that Chase Edmonds has the talent that he could take into Conner's touches. So I would try to flip Conner off of some of the great games he's had earlier this season. Get somebody that will be a more consistent performer for you down the stretch. You could probably pull off a Conner for Robinson trade. I would definitely try to do that. James Robinson, that is. And then Devonta Freeman, another sell high guy for me because he did have a touchdown this game and 16 carries, but this Baltimore running back core is a constant roulette. For all we know, Latavius Murray was just not used because he was getting eased back from his injury. So a lot of the talk around the media is that, this it's been solved. He's the number one running back for this team. I simply do not buy it because that's not how the Ravens have been at all since Lamar Jackson's been a quarterback. Because Lamar Jackson takes away the majority of their rushing touchdowns, yards, etc. Other sell high players for me. We're going to the wide receiver position now. Mike Williams. So the two Chargers receivers are almost the opposite end of each other. You've got the model of consistency, Keenan Allen, and you've got the definition of inconsistency, Mike Williams. Mike Williams blew up earlier this season, had a rough stretch in the middle. Now he had another great game. And there's an argument to be made that he's a great buy candidate because of the elite performance he showed earlier this season. But it comes down to consistency. And I would not want to be burned by one of those Mike Williams 2-point games thinking that he could get a 35-point game because we've seen it happen throughout his whole career. So now that he's had a game where he had 5 receptions, 97 yards, and a touchdown, in which most of that came on the last drive of the game, you definitely want to try to flip Mike Williams if you can. That's what I would highly recommend that you do. Brandon Ayuk is another one that I would try to flip as well. And again, there's an argument to be made that, he's getting more involved. This is the turning point. But again, I don't buy it because we've only seen this a few games this season. It's been Deebo Samuel for the most part in games that they are competitive and trying to win because Deebo Samuel is more reliable as a team. So flip Ayuk off that 7 for 55 touchdown game and try to get somebody that will be more consistent for you. Another guy I want to highlight, DJ Moore. So DJ Moore, he is the best receiver on this team. He did get a touchdown this past week, and there's people that are hyping him up a little more now that he's got better quarterback play with Cam Newton, that he's going to get more involved. But do keep in mind that this season he has only surpassed 100 yards twice. So unless he's getting a touchdown, especially in standard leagues, he's really not a great play for you. The last couple weeks in particular, he's not surpassed 70 yards. So what I would recommend with DJ Moore is to try to flip him personally off this touchdown game. Christian McCaffrey is their best receiving option. Try to use Moore to get somebody that will be... You like the target volume with Moore, but you want to try to get somebody in a better offense that will generate more yards from him, in my opinion. And then Marquise Valdez-Scantling in a game which he had 4 receptions, 123 yards, and a touchdown. He should have been dropped in a lot of leagues, but in case you were asleep and didn't update your lineup for weeks, now you're coming right back around to it by watching this video, you should definitely try to trade him off a game like this because he is not a reliable receiver at all. He's never been. You should flip him off a game like this and try to get somebody that will be better value for you. all those players I mentioned earlier, like the Pollards, the Batemans, the even the Buffalo defense, I would trade Marquise Valdez-Scantling away for. And then tight ends. So tight ends I would try to sell. I talked about them a little bit earlier. Zach Ertz, already went into detail about him, but Mike Gesicki and TJ Hawkinson, they've got top 5 difficult schedules for tight ends to close the season, and they have been inconsistent players. Week 10, both these players had 0 points. And you cannot afford that from your tight end position in the playoffs. So now that they've both put up respectable enough games and they're ranked relatively high, try to see if you can package them with another receiver. So good example. Let's say you have Hawkinson and Marquise Valdez-Scantling and you're trying to get Darren Waller. Definitely do that. I would highly recommend taking on Darren Waller over those 2 players. So good example of trying to flip those 2 tight ends. Defenses. I would try to sell the New England defense. They are the number 1 defense in the league, and but if you keep them, there's not anything wrong with that at all. But this is a good opportunity when they're coming off a 26-point game in ESPN formats to flip them for a flex. If you can get a starting running back out of the New England defense and then pick up the San Francisco defense on waivers, who's got one of the best playoff schedules for defenses, or even Arizona if they get dropped, Arizona going into their bye, I would definitely try to do that. I think there's a lot of potential value that you can get from the Patriots that you may not necessarily have, that I think would be a good opportunity for you to take advantage of. Real quick, we're going to go through waivers and drops. So waivers at the quarterback position. Guys that I like Taylor Heineke, playing a lot better as of late, really had a great game against Carolina. He gets Seattle next week, which is not anything formidable in my opinion. I think this is a great matchup for Heineke. He's a great streaming option, probably one of my favorite ones out there that's likely available. Check if Teddy Bridgewater was dropped on his bye. He's got a decent matchup against the Chargers. Just look at what Big Ben did in terms of his yardage. Teddy Bridgewater is more than capable of doing that as well. More of a lower ceiling player, but he is somebody that I do like for a matchup which he should give you some consistent value. Other ones to consider as well. So Tyrod Taylor, this is a guy that I'm not super high on because he did have 2 rushing touchdowns that inflated his value. But if you have a Mahomes or a Kyler Murray or somebody like that, and you need somebody to plug in for a week, it's not a bad consideration because he does give you that rushing floor that is so valuable. Andy Dalton, it's definitely a dart throw, but he's got Detroit this week on Thanksgiving. Not a bad option to consider there. And then a real deep league consideration. There's no news on this right now, but if he's going to start this next week. But the Saints just gave a 4-year and I think $50 million contract to Taysom Hill, which blew my mind because why would you give that money to somebody who's barely getting on the field after Jameis Winston is injured? But that, to me, says that maybe they do want to have him start to close the season to evaluate him more. So if that is the case, like stash him now. Try to see if you can get him on your roster because this is a guy that could give you some monster Jalen Hurts type numbers to close the season. So definitely if you've got a spot, pick up Taysom Hill and just see what happens. Running backs. The best running back that I like for this week is Ty Johnson. So unfortunate injury for Michael Carter. Looks like he's going to be out for a few weeks. There's some discussion of if it's going to be Ty Johnson or Tevin Coleman. I personally would rather have Johnson by far. Johnson has shown more in the PPR game, especially with Mike White if they decide to go back to him. He loves throwing to Ty Johnson even when he was the backup running back. Tevin Coleman, an older guy who's mostly past his prime. So I would try to target Ty Johnson if you can. Other guys that are interesting to me, and there's not a lot of great options out there, but there are some interesting ones. Ramondre Stevenson looks pretty involved in the Patriots offense. Should get some more involvement this next week for them as well. He's a guy that I do like for this team moving forward. And They do have a decent matchup against Tennessee that I think is beatable. So Ramondre Stevenson should get some good volume there. Other guys that I like as well that are considerable. Monitor the Jeremy McNichols injury because I believe his name is Darun Hilliard. I can't remember exactly what his first name is, but Hilliard for Tennessee had a great game, especially in the PPR formats. It's questionable to see if that's a long-term thing or a temporary thing. But if McNichols is out for a little while, Hilliard is an interesting pickup, as well as McNichols if he's dropped to try to pick up again, just because we've seen now that with all these injuries that are happening to A.J. Brown, Marcus Johnson, etc., they're going to need to rely on their running backs as a receiving option. McNichols was used in this format earlier this season when their receivers were injured, and he did pretty well. So keep an eye on these two players and pay attention to the injury news for the Tennessee backfield. DJ Dallas had a touchdown for Seattle. I generally don't like the Seattle running backs, but, Collins is playing terrible. Penny got hurt. DJ Dallas is the next up. He did have a few okay games last year, so he is an interesting consideration should he get more involved in very deep leagues. Quadri Olison, interesting as well. He played better than Wayne Gallman, who was the guy a lot of people said to pick up. Didn't really expect that, but he is somebody to consider in very deep leagues too. Guys I do not like, the whole Buffalo backfield situation of Matt Breida, Devin Singletary, and Zach Moss. None of these guys should be rostered at all, in my opinion. And then another guy that I would say is a trick out there is Rex Burkhead. Had a significant amount of carries in the game against Tennessee. But again, this is just another backfield where there's just nobody that stands out. It's a constant roulette of just meh performances week after week. Stay far away from the Houston Texans backfield. So receivers. So this is a decent week for receivers. The ones I would check the most to see if they're out there are Michael Gallup and Cedric Wilson. With CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper likely out for Thanksgiving going up against Las Vegas, I suspect that both these players should be heavily involved and have pretty good games as flex plugins. They both had, Wilson has had some great games this season. Michael Gallup has been injured, but he's shown that he's a very capable receiver in the past. Two guys that I do really like. Another one that I like is Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. We've seen the whole slew of injuries to Tennessee, and Westbrook-Ikhine played pretty well. He had 7 receptions and over 100 yards in this past game. I do suspect that they will try to get him more involved again in this next game, as he's one of the last few receivers should A.J. Brown miss another week. But we'll see what the status of Brown is, but if he's out, then Westbrook-Ikhine could be a great dart throw. Another guy that I like as well, especially in PPR leagues, Jamison Crowder. Got a touchdown with Joe Flacco. I think he will give you a good floor with the Jets and a team that's going to need to be passing it quite often, especially if Flacco comes back. Crowder is a great waiver wire pickup. And then another one to consider as well, very disappointing season relative to where he was drafted, but Laviska Shenault. With Jamal Agnew's injury, Shenault should get more work as a high-volume PPR player, kind of similar to how Jaylen Waddle is being used. But again, it's Urban Meyer, and you never know. But I would, if you got a spot, it's worth picking up Shenault and seeing what happens. Rondale Moore, similar situation. He somehow caught 11 receptions in this game out of nowhere in a lot of games where he's been very mediocre. I don't know if that's sustainable, but I think it's worth stashing him. I would not start him because he's been so inconsistent, but if he does that again, then it's very interesting to close the season, especially if Hopkins should miss more time. And then guys to avoid, do not pick up Marquez Valdez-Scantling if he's out there. And then Marquise Goodwin, long touchdown, but it's just he's not getting the volume to really be a considerable option. Tight ends, not a good week for tight ends. There's a few guys that interest me. Gerald Everett, third on the team in targets for Seattle. They have Washington next week, which should be more beatable. Gerald Everett is an interesting consideration for this week, but he's not going to give you anything special necessarily, but he is interesting. Also, Jawan Johnson for New Orleans. We just saw a breakout game from Adam Troutman, but he sprained his MCL and is likely out for a month or more. So Jawan Johnson as the tight end that is also involved and got a touchdown this game is in consideration on another team that has just been depleted by injuries. He should have a good opportunity in Week 12. Anthony Fursker had 7 targets, 5 receptions, put up a decent enough game to get by for Tennessee. A lot of this was because Jeff Swaim was injured, but if he's going to miss another week, this is a very interesting consideration for Tennessee against New England. Defenses, check if Chicago is out there. They do have a good matchup against Detroit this week. That is one of the best plays that you can have this week. Other considerations as well. Atlanta against Jacksonville is not a great matchup, but Atlanta actually played pretty well against New England. Jacksonville has been terrible on offense this season, so consider it, but Atlanta is not a defense I really like enough to really take that chance. Other considerations as well. San Francisco, this is more of a long-term stash for the playoffs. They've got Minnesota this week, but if they happen to still be out there, definitely try to pick them up. And then another defense to consider, too, going into their bye week, Kansas City. Kansas City is playing very well of late, really shedding that reputation of being a bad defense that they had earlier this season. And to close the season, they've got Denver twice, Las Vegas, and Pittsburgh, which are all defenses or offenses that are not really doing anything special right now. So this is a very sneaky ad, especially on their bye week if you have an extra spot. And then we'll talk drops for now, running a little low on time. Drops for this week. You could drop Derek Carr at this point. He's just no reason to hold him. Ryan Tannehill, if you're in more smaller league formats, Tannehill has not put up elite numbers this season. And especially if this offense is going to be without A.J. Brown for a little while, I just don't see that happening anytime soon. He is also droppable to me. Running backs, Alex Collins is not worth holding on to. He's had good opportunity with being the starting running back, but just not been able to take advantage of it at all. And then other guys, I talked about Buffalo, drop all those running backs if you have them. Wide receivers, Bryan Edwards, who somehow managed to get a carry but no targets or no receptions, and didn't even get a yard, so he ended up with a 0. And then Deshaun Jackson, those are both guys you don't need anymore. And then Jacoby Myers, another one who is just totally touchdown dependent for New England, and he's really not even giving you the high target volume anymore that you would want. He's not worth holding on to either. Dan Arnold. So there's an argument to be made that league was a fluke. But again, Jacksonville is a team that does not have a lot of weapons. And in a game where they just don't target him at all, I'm very concerned about that happening again in the playoffs. I would just avoid it because Jacksonville is a very limited offense anyway. I don't think that it's worth holding on to Arnold if there's other options out there. And then defenses, Pittsburgh, you can drop them. They're just not the defense they were in the past. And then kickers, Harrison Butker. There's no reason to hold him on the bye. Kansas City is a good offense, but they're not good enough to justify holding Butker on his bye. He's not really been a great kicker necessarily this season. That's all I've got for this video. There won't be a start sit fan bag mailbag video this week because of Thanksgiving, but comment below and I will try to get to your questions as soon as I can. And yeah, let me know if you have anything that I didn't get to talk about in this video, and I will try to help you going into week 12. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.